Hi everyone. In this video I want to discuss and present to you how the visualizer is handling the binding between the fields that are rendered on the UI and the services that are being invoked to send and get data from the underlying system. This is a bit under the hood information, but it really helps to understand how the visualizer is working and to be able to use all its functionality. So how does the visualizer takes the values from the fields that are rendered on the UI and send them as inputs to the service? And on the other way, how the visualizer is taking and analyzing the outputs that were returned from a service and render them on the UI. So let's get back to our demo application and let's try to analyze it through the login page, which is a very simple page. So on the login page we have two fields which are obviously inputs for the service that is doing the actual login. And if we'll get back to the code and see how the service call looks like, you can see that we only specify the service name. We don't specify any input parameters. But obviously this service has input parameters. Let's see how the service looks like. And if I will look at the service, I will see that it has two parameters. It has the password field and the username field, which corresponds to the fields here on the UI. So how the values gets from these fields, which are DOM HTML fields, to be inputs of the service? The answer to that is that the visualizer under the hood has a code that interacts and binds the UI to the services through the storage, the session storage of the application. The session storage of an application can be found and can be seen on the DevTools here. You click on the application tab and under session storage you would be able to see all the things that can be saved on this storage. And what happens is that whenever I enter a value to a field, let's put the values to the username and the password field. Right now nothing happens, but once I will press the login button, which will invoke the service, as you can see here, two entries were added to the session storage. And if we will see the invocation of the service, you also be able to see that the values for the username field and the password field were sent as input to the service. So what really happened here? The invocation of a service is implemented as few steps. The first step for the visualizer, and all of these things are happening automatically, the user doesn't need to do anything, it's just for you to understand how it works. So the first step would be that the visualizer will analyze the UI, will take all the values from the input fields on the screen, and then will store it on the session storage by its ID. So if the field ID, the field name, is called username field, it will create an entry where the key will be the name, the ID of the field, the username field, and the value would be the value of this field. And it will do it for all the fields that exist on this page. So before invoking the service, this will be the first step. The next step would be to take the service and analyze which input parameters it needs in order to be invoked correctly. So in the login screen, it means that it would need the username and the password values. So the visualizer will go to the session storage, will look for the username field, and if it finds it, it will take the value of it and add it as an input parameter. And the same way for the password field. If it doesn't find the entry, it will just send an empty parameter. So in this way, it will invoke the service and send it the correct parameters. This is one way of binding, the way of binding the inputs, the input fields in the UI to the inputs of a service. Just one important point is that when the visualizer invokes a service, the UI field or the input field doesn't have to be currently displayed on this page. It could be filled in a previous step. For example, if we look here on our application, after we invoke the login, the next thing was to navigate to the absences page, and on the absences page, on the onload event, we called another service which is called get absences, and this service also needs the password and the username field. And as you can see, the username and the password field does not exist on this page. But since we got to this page after we went through the login page, and since on the login page, when we invoked the login, the visualizer stored the values of the password field and the username field in the application session storage, so it could take it from there and send it as input parameters to the get absences service as well. So if the visualizer needs to invoke a service and this service needs input parameters, all we need to make sure is that these parameters were filled in the current display or in any previous step that we have done, because then it would be saved and exist in the storage. So this is one way of binding. The other way of binding is how the visualizer takes the outputs that were returned from a service and then renders them into the UI. So let's take a quick look on the get absences, and here we can see that this service returned the data in this way. On the first section, it returned two singular fields, the employee name and the employee number, which are presented here on these fields. And on a different section, it returned the list of absences that exist for this user. So the list was returned in this way, an array, and each entry of the array contains a few fields for this entry. And now the visualizer needs to bind or render these values into this UI. So how this is done? It is done in a very similar way. The first thing the visualizer will do after invoking the service, right after the service is invoked, is to go over each field and save it to the storage. So for singular fields, if I have here a field name emp name that was returned as an output, if I'll go now to the storage and look for it, I'll see that it was saved and the value was saved here. And in the same way, it will be done to the second output. For lists, for tables that are returned as output from a service, the visualizer will save each field, but with an index. That is, it will save multiple entries. Let's see how it looks. If I'll paste here this field, you'll see that it has multiple values, multiple entries, and each one of them has a suffix of an index. The index corresponds to the line in the list that was returned. So approval status _0 relates to the first entry that was returned, and this _1 for the second, and so on. So the counting starts from 0. So here I can see all the outputs that were returned from this service. And now that all the outputs are saved in the storage, the visualizer is analyzing the page, the UI, the fields that are presented on the UI, and then for each field, it checks for its ID, for the name of the field, then goes to the storage, and if this key exists on the storage, it takes the value and render it into the UI. So for singular field, it will render it here as the value of these fields. And for a table, it will go over all the values, all the multiple values of this field, and will render it as different lines of the table. So basically, this is how the binding is done. And this is important to understand because in some cases, we would need to, or we would want to get the outputs by ourselves that were returned from a service in one of the processings that we want to add to our application, or maybe we would want to change or add some input to a service that does not exist, that are not currently exist in the UI, or were not saved on a previous stage to the storage. So if we want to add an input or change an input to a service, we could just set the storage with the proper entry, and then the visualizer will take it and send it as input to the service. And in the same way, we can take the outputs that were returned from a service. Let's see the APIs for accessing the storage from the application, and also do a small example just to demo it. So if we will go to the create absence page, for example, and let's add something on the create absence. Let's add that once the absence is created, right now it will pop up a message saying absence was created. Let's enhance this message and say absence was created for user, and add here the username. So the username is actually the parameter that was entered on the first screen, on the login screen. So how would we get it? Let's see the APIs that we have in the code assist for accessing the storage. So here we have an object called storage, and for the storage we have multiple methods. The two main methods that we will go over right now are the get. Get will just get you the value of an entry in the storage by its key, and set will do the other way around. We'll set a key with a new value. So in our case, we would like to get a value, so we'll just we'll copy the get here, and we will replace the key with the name of the field, of the username field. Let's see what is the field name. To get to the name of the field, we can of course go to our application and see it in the page definition. If I'll get here to the login and go to the page fields, I can see here the name of the field. Another way to get to the name of the field is just to take it from the DOM. If the page is currently rendered, I can inspect the field, and I will see the username field here as the ID of the field. So I can take it from two places. Let's take it from here, and now let's go back to the create absence where we wanted to do the change, and let's say that I want to get the value of this field from the storage. So this will be storage get username field, and that's it. This is the way to get values from the storage. So now let's get back to our application and create a new absence. Let's see what pop-up we will get. Let's change it and press the create button. This invokes the create absence service, and I expect that the pop-up now will display the username as well. So let's see what is returned. Here it is. Absence was created for user operations. So the operations value, this one, came from the application storage. If I look here, here it is. This is where it took it from. Okay, so this is how we can get value from the storage, and I've already showed you the API to set value to the storage in case we want to influence the inputs of a service. One last thing I want to explain to you is to see the difference between the fields object and the storage object. If you remember, in previous session we also used the fields object. We used the get and the set methods of the fields to change the values that are currently presented on the page, on the UI. And there is one important difference that needs to be understood between the fields object and the storage object. The fields object reflects exactly what is currently being displayed on the UI, even before it got to the storage. So for example, if I'll go back to the login and let's make sure that and my storage is empty. Now if I'll add a value to this field, and I'll try to see if this value and try to get the value from the storage. It won't be there. Sorry. It won't be there because we didn't invoke any service yet. So the step of collecting all the values from the fields and setting them in the storage was not done yet. However, I would be able to find it on the fields object, because the fields object relates to the DOM elements that are currently rendered on the UI. So make sure to understand the difference between them, because these are two different elements that are being managed by the visualizer. And in some cases, in some timelines, they could have different values. Now, after I will invoke the login, the step of collecting the values will be performed by the visualizer. It actually was performed already. And now I will find the value on the storage. But the storage and the fields are two different things, and use them in the context that you need to use it. If you need to take something from the UI that is currently displayed, take it from the fields. If you want to influence the storage, so the input parameters or get the output parameter, the input parameters that were sent to a service will change, or to get outputs that were returned from a service, even if they are not currently rendered on the screen, on the page, then use the storage object. Thank you.